The house was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that didn't bring peace but tension. The clock in the hallway ticked rhythmically, marking the passing of another evening that felt the same as every other. The kitchen smelled of freshly cooked pasta, the plates neatly arranged on the wooden dining table, silverware aligned with precision, a picture-perfect dinner setting. Emma moved carefully, placing the last dish on the table. Her hands trembled just slightly, though she forced them to be steady. She wasn't sure why, but something about tonight felt different. Mark sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone, his expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken much since he walked through the door. That was always a bad sign. Across from her sat Liam, their 10-year-old son, his eyes darting between his father and mother, as if trying to measure the temperature of the room. He had learned to do that young, too young. Beside him, little Sophie, barely 7, swung her feet beneath her chair, humming a tune under her breath. She was still too small to fully understand the game they all played, the game of silence, of not making mistakes, of never provoking the man at the head of the table. Emma took her seat, forcing a smile. "Dinner's ready." Mark looked up finally, his blue eyes sharp. "Took you long enough," he muttered, picking up his fork. Emma bit the inside of her cheek but said nothing. Liam reached for the pasta, carefully serving Sophie first, the way he had seen his mother do 100 times. He was always gentle with her, protective in a way no child should have to be. The meal went on in uneasy silence, the only sounds being the clinking of utensils against ceramic plates. And then, it happened. Sophie, in her excitement to grab her glass, miscalculated. The cup tipped over, and bright red juice spilled across the pristine white tablecloth. The silence shattered. Mark's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. The veins in his temple pulsed. Sophie froze, her tiny fingers clutching the edge of the table. I'm sorry, Daddy," she whispered. Emma's heart pounded against her ribs. She reached for a napkin, moving quickly. "It's okay, honey. It's just juice." Mark slammed his fist against the table. The sound was sharp, violent. Sophie flinched, shrinking back in her chair. "You can't even sit still for one damn meal?" His voice was low, controlled, the most dangerous kind. Liam instinctively moved his hand across the table, gently resting it over Sophie's. "It was an accident, Dad." Mark's gaze flickered to Liam. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Number, not Liam. But Mark had already pushed his chair back. He stood up slowly, towering over the table. Liam stiffened, but he didn't lower his eyes. That was his first mistake. "You think you get to talk back to me now?" Mark's voice was dangerously calm. Liam's fingers curled into fists on his lap. "I just—" The slap came fast, cracking through the air like a gunshot. Sophie let out a small choked sob. Liam's face jerked to the side, red blooming across his cheek. He didn't cry. He never cried. Emma forced herself to stay still. If she moved, if she said the wrong thing, it would only escalate. Mark sat back down like nothing had happened. "Clean this mess up," he muttered, picking up his fork again. Emma swallowed down the bile rising in her throat. She reached for a cloth, dabbing at the spilled juice with trembling hands. Liam didn't move, his small shoulders rigid. Sophie wiped her eyes, but her little hands still shook as she held onto her brother. Emma wanted to scream, to throw the plates against the wall, to grab her children and run. But she didn't. She did what she always did. She cleaned up the mess. That night, long after dinner had ended, after the dishes had been washed and put away, and after Mark had retreated to his office with a glass of whiskey in hand, Emma stood by Liam's bedroom door, watching her son from the dimly lit hallway. He sat on his bed, a book open in his lap, but he wasn't reading. His fingers traced the spine absent-mindedly, his cheek still flushed from the slap. The anger in his eyes wasn't the kind a 10-year-old should have. She stepped inside softly, careful not to wake Sophie, who was curled up under a blanket on the small mattress across the room. The nightlight cast a warm glow over her tiny frame. Even in sleep, she clung to her stuffed rabbit like it was her shield against the monsters she couldn't name. Liam didn't look up when Emma sat beside him. He just kept his eyes on the book. "Let me see," she whispered. He turned his face slightly, allowing her fingers to gently brush against his bruised cheek. He flinched but didn't pull away. "I'm okay, Mom," he said, voice tight. Emma swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have talked back to him." Liam's head snapped toward her, eyes flashing with disbelief. "You're saying it's my fault?" "No." Emma's voice cracked. "No, baby, but I need you to be careful. You know how he is." Liam let out a shaky breath and looked down at his lap. "I just hate him." The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried more weight than any shout. Emma closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. She wrapped an arm around her son, pulling him close. "I know," she whispered. "I know." They sat like that for a while, listening to the soft hum of the house. Outside, the wind rattled against the windows, but inside everything was still. Then the sound of footsteps, heavy, unhurried. Emma tensed. Liam froze. The door creaked open. Mark stood in the doorway, filling the frame with his broad shoulders. His silhouette was backlit by the dim hallway light, making his presence even more imposing. Emma turned quickly, shifting herself slightly in front of Liam. "I was just checking on them." Mark's eyes flicked from her to Liam, and for a second, something unreadable passed over his face. He stepped inside, moving with slow, deliberate movements. Liam stiffened, gripping the book in his lap. Mark crouched in front of him, forcing their eyes to meet. "Are we going to have any more problems?" Liam didn't answer. He held his father's gaze, but his small hands trembled. Mark reached out, placing a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "You're a smart boy. You don't want to upset me, right?" Emma could barely breathe. She wanted to grab Mark's wrist, to shove him away, but she knew better. After a long pause, Liam shook his head. "No, sir." Mark smiled. "That's my boy." He straightened, gave Emma a lingering look, then turned and walked out, shutting the door behind him. Liam exhaled shakily. Emma hugged him tighter. But she knew. This wasn't over. The following weeks passed in a haze of tension. Mark's moods were unpredictable, his temper short. Emma learned to measure the danger in the way he opened the front door, in the weight of his footsteps as he entered the house. One evening, after losing a major client at work, Mark came home in a foul mood. Emma knew it the second she heard the door slam shut. She hurried to the kitchen, hoping that having dinner ready would ease whatever storm was brewing inside him. Liam and Sophie sat at the table, eating quietly. The rule was simple. Don't talk unless spoken to. Don't make noise. Don't attract attention. Mark strode into the room, his suit jacket crumpled, his tie loosened. He barely glanced at Emma before pouring himself a glass of whiskey. The silence was suffocating. Then as Emma placed his plate in front of him, his expression darkened. "What is this?" His voice was quiet, but the sharpness in it made her freeze. Emma swallowed. "Pasta. I don't want pasta." The words sent a ripple of panic through her. She had cooked it because it was his favorite. I can make something else." Mark didn't respond. He set his glass down forcefully, the sound making Sophie flinch. Then in one swift motion, he grabbed Emma's wrist. She gasped, the pressure unbearable as he pulled her close. "Are you completely useless?" His grip tightened. "Do I come home from a shit day and have to deal with this?" "Mark, please," Emma whispered. Liam stood up suddenly. "Let her go." Mark's head snapped toward him. "What did you just say?" Liam's hands were clenched into fists. He was shaking, but he didn't look away. Emma's breath caught. "No, baby. Please don't." Mark let go of Emma and turned toward Liam. "You think you're a man now?" His voice was deadly quiet. "You think you can talk back to me?" Liam didn't move. Mark lunged forward. Emma stepped between them, but it was too late. Mark's hand shot out, striking Liam across the face. The boy fell back, crashing into his chair. Sophie screamed, scrambling away from the table. Emma rushed to Liam's side. "Liam, baby!" Mark exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. He didn't look sorry. He never did. Then, as if nothing had happened, he walked past them, heading toward his office. "Clean this mess up," he muttered before slamming the door shut. Emma turned to Liam. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. She touched his cheek. "Are you okay?" Liam swallowed hard. His voice was barely a whisper. "We have to leave." Emma's heart clenched. She nodded. Emma had spent years surviving in silence, but now everything was unraveling. She drove home from Jessica's house in a haze, her fingers gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Jessica had begged her to leave, to take the kids and run. But where? Mark had made sure she had nowhere to go. As she pulled into the driveway, her stomach twisted. Mark's car was already there. He wasn't supposed to be home yet. Inside, she found Liam sitting at the kitchen table, unusually quiet. He looked up at her, his face tense. "Mom," he whispered. "I think he knows." Emma's heart dropped. "Knows what?" Liam hesitated. "That you want to leave." Emma's blood turned to ice. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Jessica. "I called Michael. He's coming. Be ready." The porch light snapped on. A cold voice cut through the night. "Where do you think you're going?" Mark stood in the doorway barefoot, his eyes burning with fury. Then, the front door slammed open. Michael, her brother, and behind him, 2 police officers. Mark hesitated, his grip tightening on Emma's arm for one last second before finally releasing her. The officers moved fast. Mark didn't even resist as they grabbed his arms, forcing them behind his back. As they pulled him toward the door, his gaze locked onto Emma's. "You'll regret this," he hissed. Emma met his eyes and for the first time in years didn't look away. "No," she whispered. "I won't." Mark was dragged outside, his shouts fading into the night. Emma turned, scanning the room frantically. Liam stood in the hallway, breathing heavily, his small fist clenched. Sophie, still in Emma's arms, buried her face in her mother's neck. Michael stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "It's over, Em," he said softly. "You're safe now." Emma closed her eyes for the first time in years. She believed him. The sirens had long faded, but Emma still felt them ringing in her head. The house was silent now, eerily so. She stood in the middle of the living room, clutching Sophie tightly to her chest. Liam hovered near the staircase, watching the front door like he expected Mark to burst back in at any moment. But he wouldn't. Michael placed a steadying hand on Emma's shoulder. "Come on," he said gently. "We can't stay here." Emma turned slowly, her eyes sweeping the house, the place that had been both her home and her prison. The pictures on the walls, the polished wooden floors, the furniture she had once picked out with care. None of it belonged to her anymore. Maybe it never had. She exhaled shakily. "Where will we go?" Michael squeezed her shoulder. "For now, with me." Emma nodded, too numb to argue. Liam took Sophie's hand as they stepped outside. The air was cold, crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat that always seemed to linger inside the house. As they walked toward Michael's car, Emma glanced back one last time. The porch light flickered above them, and then she turned away. They were never coming back. The first few nights in Michael's apartment were strange. It was small, just a 2-bedroom unit with faded carpets and mismatched furniture. But it was safe. Safe in a way Emma hadn't felt in years. Liam had trouble sleeping. He would lie awake for hours staring at the ceiling, his body tense even in rest. Sophie clung to Emma more than ever, whimpering whenever she was out of sight for too long. Emma barely slept at all. The nightmares came every night. Mark's voice, his hands around her throat, the way he had looked at her the moment the police took him away. She would jolt awake, gasping, reaching for Sophie to make sure she was still there. Michael never said anything when he found her sitting at the kitchen table in the middle of the night, staring at her untouched cup of tea. He would simply sit across from her, silent but present. On the 4th night, he finally spoke. "You need to start thinking about what's next." Emma let out a hollow laugh. "Next?" Michael leaned forward. "Yes, Mark's gone. You're safe. But you need a plan." Emma swallowed hard. "I don't even know where to start." Michael slid a piece of paper across the table. "I do." She hesitated before picking it up. A lawyer's name, a caseworker, a counselor, a list of shelters and resources. Emma traced her fingers over the names, her throat tightening. Michael reached for her hand. "You're not alone in this." Emma met his gaze, and for the first time she believed him. 2 weeks later, Emma sat in a courtroom, gripping her hands together so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Mark sat across from her, his suit crisp, his expression blank. The proceedings dragged on for hours, statements, testimonies, legal arguments. Emma barely heard any of it. All she could think about was Liam and Sophie. Then the judge spoke. The court grants full custody to the plaintiff, Emma Taylor. A permanent restraining order against Mark Taylor has been approved. Emma inhaled sharply, the weight of the words settling over her like a tidal wave. It was over. Really, truly over. Mark turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. Then for the first time, he spoke. You'll regret this. Emma met his eyes, her heart steady. No, she whispered, I won't. A month later, they moved into a small apartment of their own. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, second-hand furniture. But it was theirs. Liam got the bigger room, insisting Sophie take the smaller one, because she's still little. He spent the first night setting up her bed, making sure her stuffed animals were lined up just the way she liked. Emma watched them from the doorway, her chest aching. They were healing, slowly but surely. That first night they ate pizza on the floor, the 3 of them wrapped in blankets. Sophie giggled as she licked sauce off her fingers, and for the first time in years, Emma laughed. Really, truly laughed. Liam looked at her, his eyes bright. You're happy? Emma nodded. Yeah, she whispered. I think I am. The next morning, Emma woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, panic hit. Where was she? What time was it? Was Mark? Then she remembered. She was safe. She was free. A knock at the door startled her. She glanced at the clock. 10:30 a.m. Frowning, she pulled on a sweater and opened the door. Daniel stood there. Emma blinked in surprise. Daniel? He gave a small smile, shoving his hands into his pockets. Hey. She hesitated. What are you doing here? He cleared his throat. I heard about the case. I just wanted to check on you. Make sure you're okay. Emma studied him for a long moment. She had spent so long keeping everyone at arm's length, convincing herself that she didn't need anyone. But standing here, in her new home, with her children sleeping safely behind her, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could let someone in again. She stepped aside. Come in. Daniel looked surprised but smiled. And for the first time in a long, long time, Emma felt like she was finally stepping into the light.